Aphantasia is the inability to visualize in the mind's eye. 0.5% of the population have no imagery in any of the senses. So I'm in that category. I don't have imagination. I don't have motor. I don't have gustatory, tactile, any of them. Aphantasia is not a disability or a disadvantage. It's a different way of perceiving the world. But even if someone were to say, here's this pill, take it and you can visualize forever, I'd probably say no. Because mental imagery is a double-edged sword.
At the age of 25, Tom Ebeyer's life turned upside down when he realized he couldn't visualize images in his mind's eye. He instantly became obsessed with this different way of perceiving the world and has since built the largest aphantasia organization and community in the world. Now the Aphantasia Network supports aphantasia research across the globe, boasts a community of over 70,000 members, and their aphantasia test has been taken over 1.5 million times. If your inner monologue has just whispered that you might not be able to visualize an apple, then stick around. You might learn something wild about how your own mind works. And as always, subscribe to the channel so you can truly understand the full, weird, and wonderful spectrum of the conscious experience.
Craig Venter helped sequence the human genome. He has aphantasia. Ed Catmull, the co-founder of Pixar with Steve Jobs, he has aphantasia. Glenn Keane, he's the animator behind The Little Mermaid, right? So he's the guy who actually drew The Little Mermaid.
Do you dream?
Very interesting topic. By far, most people who have it don't know that they have it. Evan, I heard from somebody like 2 weeks ago who was, I think, 92. Wow. Just discovered this because they read it in a newspaper article or something.
Wow.
So you can definitely go your entire life without realizing this.
Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Evan.
What is aphantasia?
Aphantasia is the inability to visualize in the mind's eye. The inability to create images that are not present to the senses. But it's not just images, it can be all of the senses. So, I'll do the kind of traditional thing. Evan, if I ask you to think of a horse, does some kind of image of a horse come to your mind?
Absolutely. I can picture the background. I can picture the texture of the fur. Yeah, I can produce quite, I think, a detailed scene there. Not 1080p 4K, but there's a scene there. I don't know, maybe 720p.
So that ability to picture things inside your mind, that is, I think, something people kind of take for granted. There's 3 to 4% of the population who can't do that at all. And then if I say think of the horse, the thing with the horse is it's a multi-sensory experience. So some people say they can smell it, they can kind of feel the texture of the fur on their hands. They can hear the sound of the horse neighing. So it can be a multi-sensory experience, and there's a portion of people who have aphantasia who can't do any of those things.
Right. The reason that I was so interested in having this conversation is I've kind of been on this train of fascination on the spectrum of consciousness, right? All of the infinite different ways that people experience the world. And I've been speaking to different people that are experts in the areas or either are neurodivergent in some way. And I work a lot with my sister. She does a lot of editing, and something came up which was just completely insane to us, where she was editing a podcast on aphantasia. I was speaking to Dr. Russell Hollerbush. He's an expert in inner experience. And literally just while editing the video, she was doing one of these can you visualize an apple tests. And she closed her eyes and then immediately called me and was like, these apple tests, like when they say to visualize an apple, you can't actually see an apple, can you? And I was like, no, I can see the apple. Like I can see the shading. I can take a bite out of the apple. I can see everything. And she's like, I can't. She can't at all. And that blew us away. Both of us completely blew us away. She's 31 years old and we think she is fully aphantasia.
Yeah, and it just goes to show you can go your entire life, be in a creative career like she is, working with video and stuff, and not be able to visualize. It's quite a fascinating thing, and it really does show the spectrum of human consciousness, of human abilities, and how these things are invisible differences. Things that you can get along with someone, your own sister. You've known her, their whole life. You guys obviously get along if you work together, and not know something so deep about the way she experiences the world every single day.
Right. It's so interesting. It really blew us away. And she's still really processing it kind of bit by bit. When when people come to you and they have this realization, often quite late in life, what do you tell them?
There's a few things. I think most importantly is aphantasia is not a disability or a disadvantage. It's a different way of perceiving the world. It's easy to romanticize the idea of mental imagery, but even if someone were to say, here's this pill, take it and you can visualize forever, I'd probably say no, because mental imagery is a double-edged sword. And I think that that's
Right.
one of the things that people have a hard time wrapping their mind around, especially if, for someone like me who can't do it. It took me a long time to come to that realization that, one, we can we can excel. There's successful aphantasics in basically every field you could imagine. Art, engineering, science, math, movies, acting, whatever you think of a field, there's successful aphantasics. So it's not a hindrance to success. It's just a different approach to the world, to that kind of conscious experience. And that piece about imagery being a double-edged sword, there are some advantages. And I think by focusing, because it's defined, aphantasia, denotes the absence of fantasia. So it's
Yes.
defined as lacking something. That inherently puts people in kind of a negative mindset about it, because you can't do something someone else can do. But, another way to think about it is like image-free thinking. It's kind of like a more positive spin on it. And some of those, I think, positives outweigh, or at least balance out, some of the negatives. And so, having some of those conversations, I think, kind of help people shift people's mindset about the experience.
It makes complete sense. I mean, you have to assume things like PTSD, some forms of depression, some forms of anxiety. I'm really curious, are there any proven studies or, proven analysis on people with aphantasia and how they suffer those kinds of mental illnesses? Because on first sort of thought, you might think they might not suffer them as much, because those illnesses, I mean, of course, they vary in how they experience them as much as anything else, but they seem quite visual, especially PTSD, like flashing back to those traumatic scenes. Has there been any work done there?
Their work has started on this. There's kind of two. So one, the kind of, let's say, the science isn't out on this. There's some kind of differing perspectives. It's definitely possible to still have, different types of anxieties or depressions or things with aphantasia. They definitely present differently. And the question is if the intensity of them, is maybe experienced in the same way. And it intuitively makes sense because, like you say, intrusive imagery, there's, this is one of those pieces of imagery being a double-edged sword. For most people, lots of mental images are completely involuntary. They're not
Right.
choosing to see the pictures that they see. Something triggers them in their environment or, in a conversation, and memories from their past or their past experiences kind of trigger and flood in their mind. And that can put them in a kind of different type of state. You're far more protected from those types of experiences. Because you're still at the kind of conceptual level rather than that sensory one. Of course, images aren't the only way. So, for someone who doesn't have images but might still have vivid sounds or, other type of kind of sensory experiences, they can just, those memories and stuff can be triggered in the other senses.
Yes.
But for that small subsegment who has no sensory experience in any of the domains, let's say, the more domains you're missing, the more insulated you are from those. And there's some pretty, interesting conversations I've had about this that, really illustrate the point. So, there's ones that are, just more interesting. So, for example, spoke with a sports psychologist in Australia, works with Olympic level athletes. He works with this Olympic runner who one time tripped and fell during a race while he was in college. And then, ever since, every time he goes to run, all he can see in his mind is himself tripping and falling. And
Wow.
so this image, this experience that he had is kind of like stuck with him. And, his whole goal is to try and get rid of these images, to, get rid of those negative intrusive thoughts that, he might fall again. To the more extreme ones where, I spoke with a first responder highway patrol in the U.S. who, at the end of his, as a highway patrolman, comes up on many violent accidents and pretty horrific stuff you see on the highway. He talks about how his aphantasia, he believes, has completely helped him deal
Wow.
with those kind of traumatic experiences. Many of his colleagues, have retired or are out because of the PTSD, because they'll get home and they'll be seeing the images of what they saw
Yeah.
at work that day. And he gets home and he's like, I sleep like a baby. It's not that I don't care or I wasn't impacted by them. I was, but when I get home, it's just like, it doesn't stay with me. It's just an idea, a concept that happened. And so, there's, really interesting implications in some of these fronts.
It makes complete sense. Not that I'm an Olympic athlete by any stretch, but I play a lot of tennis, and I have had moments of being on the tennis court and flashing back to memories I had in the past, extremely vivid memories of me being unable to play tennis, basically, where I've just been really stressed and I'm hitting the net and I can't remember my swing. And sometimes every now and again I would just transport back there and I'll get so nervous and immediately I'll have that sweat response. So I'll start sweating and I'll be like, oh God, please don't go back to that moment. And it's like a really visual, and also it's a motor imagination there. I think I have quite a strong motor imagination. I can visualize and mentalize that the motor activity and the motor coordination very well, and that cripples me. And I like if I could pay to just delete those memories, I absolutely would, because it really holds me back sometimes. I remember playing college level tennis and just like flashing back to like 5 years previously and be like, please don't forget how to hit a second serve or something. You flash back into this one particular stroke and you're just crippled by that memory. You're crippled by all the emotional baggage of that. So I mean, it makes complete sense to me that there's a lot of benefits to this. And
Yeah, it's a great example.
it didn't even occur to me that you can have, like, it's not a compensatory thing strictly, where if someone has a lack of visual imagery that they will have another sense of imagination that compensates for that. They might be better, or I shouldn't say better, or have more vivid or rich motor experiences, gustatory experiences, olfactory experiences. How do you see those things co-present? You have very extreme examples of people who have very limited experience across all of the boards. Do they usually
Yeah,
compensate for each other?
there's about a half. I mean, there's lots of debate about the numbers and stuff, but I think right now they're saying about 0.5% of the population have no imagery in any of the senses. So I'm in that category. I don't have imagination. I don't have motor. I don't have gustatory, tactile, any of them. I think if you do have some of the other ones, you probably lean on them more just because you've learned to navigate the world that way. Um, but I think what's important is, like, that doesn't mean you can't process visual information or you can't process auditory information. Of course, like, Evan, if I see you again, I'll recognize you. Your image is like stored in my mind somewhere. It's just
Yes.
the retrieval of the image, right? That's really impacted. So, tonight if someone asks me, what did Evan look like, I'll have very vague descriptions, but I won't, have something that I can recall and reference to do that kind of description. I think
Right.
where you see some kind of areas of compensation, it's like, and not everyone with aphantasia is the same. So, I don't want to paint everyone who has the trait with, the same brush, because, we're all humans, we're all complex. It's not the only thing that kind of, makes you who you are. But let's say in general terms, things like, we see lots of like conceptual type of thinking, like working with ideas. This idea that there's a difference between. I'm just trying to think of the word. It's like, the difference between a concept and a token versus a type. That's what I was looking for. So a token is like a individual representation. Like when I said the horse, someone will see a brown horse in a field with green grass, standing by a picket fence. Like that's a token. You've pre-selected, you've rendered a whole bunch of individual characteristics of the broader concept of a horse.
I think that's exactly what I visualized. I think that is exactly
that's the most
what I visualized.
That's the most common one. But some people, I've heard some really, really crazy responses to that. One of the most interesting ones, someone told me, I was at a university doing a talk on this, and one of the students comes up after me and she's like, all I can see is this Minecraft horse made out of blocks.
Right.
Because she's been playing Minecraft so much. And so the Minecraft horse is another token. It's another visual representation of all the possible horses that could be.
Yeah.
And so, so I'm trying to get to this point where it's like staying at that type level, that concept of horses. I know horses could be black or brown or white. I know they can, run on a racetrack or plow a field or stand in the, in the meadow. I haven't, when you ask me to think of a horse, I haven't selected any of those attributes.
Right.
It's just the concept of a horse. If we want to talk about horses, I can tell you all of these details. But when people, this is one of those things where I think there's a huge advantage in aphantasia that's abstract and hard to describe, but it's this idea that like when you're still at that concept level, you haven't, I don't know if it's fair to say like you haven't biased your thinking, but like when you have a clear token, you've already pre-assumed lots of characteristics, lots of things. And so how often are people talking with the same language but have totally different internal visual representations of the things? That's just a simple idea of a horse. Imagine as the ideas get more complex, more room for variety, abstract concepts and things, people have very different internal representations of those things. So that's one of those areas I think aphantasia, abstract thinking, is really fascinating, in an area that personally we're really interested at the Aphantasia Network to kind of exploring further.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. When and how did you find out that you have aphantasia? Because I think even the how is almost more interesting, because the when seems like it can happen really late in life, but I wonder how many people go through their entire life without realizing it. Because my sister wouldn't have realized it unless she was editing an aphantasia video. It's just like the circumstance is so random.
Evan, I heard from somebody like 2 weeks ago who was, I think, 92. Wow. Just discovered this because they read it in a newspaper article or something.
Wow.
So you can definitely go your entire life without realizing this. How for me, I was just, for whatever reason, circumstance, discovered it, relatively early. I discovered it in like 2010, before there was a word for it, and I had come home from a party with, my ex-girlfriend from the time, who like, she's like, oh, what, Joanne was wearing the same thing she was wearing when we saw her last year. And I was genuinely like, confused. How do you remember what she was wearing last year? That's just something I could never do.
Right.
And she's like, oh, I just see this picture of her in my mind. And like, I was obsessed from that moment. Like, what do you mean you see this picture? I turned into the guy at all the parties, like, think of a horse. Like, can you picture it? And, I came out on a paper in like 2013 or 2014 from Dr. Adam Zeman in the UK, who studied a man who lost the ability to visualize.
Wow.
During he had a stroke during heart surgery, woke up from that heart surgery, not able to visualize anymore. Dr. Zeman had just written a magazine article saying, look at this interesting case. And he heard from me and like 20 others who were like, hey, I've never been able to visualize. And that kind of kicked off a number of studies. So we at the time we did lots of different things, like what's a darker shade of green, an evergreen tree or a blade of grass? I know the evergreen tree is darker. Historically, the literature would say the only way you can answer that question is by visualizing the grass, visualizing the tree, and then choosing. But it's like I have that visual information encoded, I just don't picture it.
Right.
Other things like, can you count the number of homes? Can you count the number of windows in your home? Yeah, I can do it. It's an intellectual exercise. So like I have to go through it logically. Like, okay, I walk in, I up the stairs, there's a window there. So it takes me some time because I have to like reason it through. but I'm
Right.
highly accurate in answering, the question. It just, there's just a time constraint. And so we did lots of kind of, tests like that. And in 2015, he wrote the paper Congenital Aphantasia. And, rest is kind of history, I guess. Did some interviews with like the New York Times and a bunch of other kind of big publications, and started hearing from people like literally all over the world who were like, "Hey, I've never been able to do this. What does it mean for us?" And that kind of was the genesis of the Aphantasia Network.
Right. I think that's kind of the stage that my sister is in now. I wouldn't say that it's, she's not struggling with it per se, but she's kind of trying to just understand what it means, like what the significance is to having aphantasia with her memories. She's thinking back to all of her memories, and she's saying, photos have always had huge importance to me. And now that might be the reason, now I might know that that's because I haven't been able to mentally visualize. And she's thinking back to all of these trips she did, and she went hiking in Nepal, and she knows she was there, and she has a rich emotional experience of it and rich emotional sensation, but she can't visualize it per se. And she's kind of just trying to wrap her head around all of that and wrap her head around what that means, what's the significance of it, and what it means going forward. What is the link between aphantasia and memory?
Yeah, memory is one of those big areas where there are real differences, specifically in the autobiographical sense. So that's memory of your own life. I think you've spoken with Brian Levine on the podcast before.
I have, yeah. Great guy. Loved our conversation, yeah.
Yeah, really, really great guy. But a big part of memory for most people is the ability to kind of re-experience that mental time travel.
Yes.
It's to kind of relive these past events. For me and most people with aphantasia, memory, I describe it, to me it's kind of like, it's like trivia. It's like a set of facts, like things I know that I've done things. I know that, I lived in Turkey for 3 months. I know, I backpacked through Europe. I know, I went to university at the University of Queens to do my master's. Like I know lots of things about my life. I can tell you who was there. I can even sequence them, generally well, but they don't have an emotional connection to me. Like I can maybe get emotional about them in the present if I think about sad or extremely happy memories. I lost my mom when I was in high school. Of course, I can in the present like reminisce and think about all the how life could be different if that wasn't the case, and that can have an emotional impact on me now, but I can't re-experience what it was like at the time. I don't remember the emotions from the time. I can't time travel in any kind of way. It's
right.
like most of it is intellectual, and there's also this kind of time constraint in that in order to experience, it's like that idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And so for me to think about my memories, to paint a picture, so to say, I have to say 1,000 words, and it takes time to say 1,000 words. Like I want to think about this time in my past. I have to sit there and think it out, and
right.
So I'm also not very past oriented, just from a practical perspective. Like. I think a lot of aphantasics are very present oriented. Like it's not that you can't think about the past or think about the future, but without that mental time travel, it's just different.
Yes, it's really interesting. I think this is the main thing that's kind of impacting how she's thinking about this, and just really thinking about her memories. It's interesting that nothing has changed, right? In that she's learned a label, a word, like a category, and now she's rethinking all of these different things. So she's always been a highly, highly creative person. She did an arts degree. She's been a designer. She's ran her own jewelry business. Highly, highly creative. And now, after 31 years, she's realizing for the first time that she's never imagined what she's going to make. Like she has like an emotional idea. Like I think she feels a lot. That's a big difference in the way you describe her memories to her, because I think she does have still a very strong emotional connection to her memories and her experiences. But we were thinking about it that like I'm rubbish at drawing. I'm terrible. And I think that's partly, now I have no talent in it, but one part of it is that sometimes I try and visualize it in my head and then I try and draw what I visualize. Whereas she doesn't do that, and she's completely unconstrained because she doesn't have any visual imagery. But she told me an interesting story there where she was teaching. She's also an English teacher. She was teaching in front of a class, and she was drawing a pin or something. And for the first time in her entire life, she realized that she couldn't imagine the pin, and she like froze. She was like, this is crazy. Like I've been an artist my entire life, but I've never had this moment of like, how do I draw that? Because I can't visualize it. Now she obviously did draw the pin because she knows how, but she drew it upside down. And like, it's just, I find that so interesting that nothing's changed in that her brain isn't any different, but she's learned a category, a label. How when you learn that category, when you learn that label, how did you process that? How did the label help? Did it help make sense of your life, your past, your experience? Talk to me about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that because I had already known that I couldn't visualize, like I was already, I had already gone through a lot of the stages of grief, so to say. I think many who do discover they have aphantasia have some of that grief-like symptoms, because, I mean, it's hard to say you lost something that you never knew you had, but it's easy to compare and romanticize. But for me, because I was, I had already kind of come through a lot of those feelings, the label aphantasia helped validate, I guess, this, thing that I'd been talking to everybody about for so long, because many people just didn't believe me.
Right.
Hard, like for people who visualize, like all day long, hard for them to accept that it's even possible to, live and be a, functioning member of society without the ability, to visualize, especially because I'd done some creative stuff as well. And I mean, that's changed now that aphantasia has got a lot of research and, there's some like pretty strong science behind it now. But in those early days, like it was very much, you're just, imagining this or whatever, which is a funny turn of phrase. But so for me, it helped. I will say, I think there was even some research done in Germany that showed that for about 30% of people who discover they have this, though, they do have a psychological stressor, kind of a reaction to it. So the discovery, puts them in that kind of mindset where they don't, they're stressed that they're different, they can't do this thing,
Right.
And so that's a totally natural response, I think, for a lot of people to be concerned about it and to be worried about it. But I think for most people, those feelings, as they start to kind of wrap their mind around it, those feelings start to pass, especially if it's congenital, meaning you've had it from birth, because then you've learned all the kind of coping techniques, the different kind of strategies and approaches. Whereas if it's acquired aphantasia, so you've got this because of either some physical trauma or emotional trauma, which does happen. We don't know how often, but it is possible. Those folks are a little bit of a different case because they didn't grow up with it. They didn't necessarily learn those coping techniques or different kind of alternative strategies. I just want to pick up on something you said about around your sister and the creative side. So the end of 2021, we did the Extreme Imagination Conference, and one of the days was really focused on creatives, and so we had non-visualizers and hyper-visualizers come to sit on a panel together and talk about their creative experience. We did a little thing with the audience where we'd put up a piece of art and we'd get people to guess, did this come from a hyper-visualizer or non-visualizer?
That's cool.
Most people, no one knew. You can't tell the difference on the actual outcome, right? Yeah. So that just goes to show that, in terms of artistic talent, it's very difficult to tell the difference. But one of the big differences really was when they described their process. So similar to your sister, the aphants said, they had like a concept or a feeling about something they wanted to create.
Yes.
But they didn't have an image or an exact thing that they wanted to do. It's just a feeling or this kind of concept. And the creative process is like a discovery process right? And so they're, whatever their medium is, let's say it's painting for the sake, as they paint, it kind of comes into fruition, and then they have is this what I was thinking? Yes or no, and then they kind of massage it until they got to a point where they were very happy with it. Whereas the hypervisualizers were completely the opposite. Whereas they were like, I have this exact thing in my mind, and the whole creative process really is a copying process from that internal representation onto the page.
Yes.
And actually, they talked a lot more about the disappointment that they would have because their expectation of what it should look like in their mind wasn't represented properly on the page.
Right.
And so this expectation difference was also one of the things I found very interesting because, it's easier to be disappointed if you have an exact thing in your mind that you can't reach, as opposed to having an idea in your mind and then seeing it and feeling if it matches.
Yes.
So that was pretty cool to see.
I love that. Those are such interesting examples. Are there any other differences in thinking? Like just like you kind of talked through the thought process when they're making something creative, but has there been or have you come across any differences in just thinking itself, decision making, anything related to, just main sort of cognitive processes?
I mean, I think the big one really is, so when I'll say again, a lot of it is anecdotal. I think one of the big things is the abstract kind of thinking, that one that we talked about a little bit earlier. But honestly, the rest of it is hard because, we run these meetups in our member community once a month. So we'll have, AFANs come and they'll talk about their experience, and, you'll see AFANs who, great at directions and some that are terrible at directions. Some who love to read and some who hate to read fiction. Some, who are great at this and then horrible at that. So really, I think what's so surprising is kind of the different variations or the different manifestations of it. And it's that I think what the most important takeaway, for someone maybe who's just discovering this as they're listening, like, hey, I also can't visualize. It's like the, belief is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so if you start to tell yourself that, you can't be creative or you can't, do this or can't do that, like that's kind of what, the outcome might be. But
right.
If you try and find ways, or an alternate approach, then, you'd be quite surprised. I mean, guys like, Craig Venter helped sequence the human genome. He has aphantasia. Ed Catmull, the co-founder of Pixar with Steve Jobs, he has aphantasia. Glenn Keane, he's the animator behind The Little Mermaid, right? So he's the guy who actually drew The Little Mermaid.
That's amazing.
And, he has aphantasia, and it's amazing.
Example.
Yeah, when you watch him, so he has some little videos, and it might be on our website. You can find them somewhere. When he's sketching Ariel, his facial expressions, he's like making these very funny facial expressions, but that's how he's trying to understand or interpret like how Ariel, should be looking in this, particular scene. So it just goes to show like the different approaches and stuff, that you can find, that work for you.
I absolutely love that. I remember in my conversation with Brian Levine, we started talking about how there seems to be a greater amount of theoretical physicists that have aphantasia, because that's one of those areas that's so abstract that any sort of visual image that you can conjure up is probably misleading. It's probably giving you a false intuition or sending you down a wrong direction. When you're in 12-dimensional string theory, your ability to visualize that is probably going to give you wrong impressions about what it should look like. And if you don't have any mental imagery, it means you can really kind of wade through those really murky waters that just make no sense to other people, the really, really abstract stuff.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of that point I was trying to talk about earlier, the difference between tokens and types, right? Yeah. Like there is no token that you're going to generate of 12th dimensional string theory that's going to like help move the needle forward.
Yeah.
Right. And so staying at the conceptual level in lots of different areas probably have quite the benefit.
I actually think I probably am too constrained by the things that I imagine. I think I would like to be able to see outside those boxes more often and kind of push beyond the boundaries that my sensory experience and imagination places. Although maybe that's again what you just said of self-belief, and I'll just believe that I can do that, and hopefully that'll make a difference.
And it does go to show that there are, like, you know, there's pros and cons to every kind of different type of internal experience, and so playing to your own internal advantages is like, that's just how you get the most out of life. There's no other way, because for non-visualizer, it's not like you can turn it on, at least not yet. And so trying to find ways that work for you and your cognitive style, and exploring that fully, I think is just the pragmatic side of me is just try and find the advantages in that experience.
Yeah, well said. Do you dream?
Very interesting topic. I dream. How would I describe it? I don't have visual dreams. I'm not. Now, most aphantasics describe having visual dreams. I am not one of those. But I do dream. The way I would describe it, it's like it's conceptual, it's language based, but me in my dream can recognize and respond to visual cues. So I'll be like, hey, look at that purple wall. And I'll know that I'm looking at a purple wall, but I won't actually have a visual representation of it in my conscious or dream conscious kind of state.
Yes.
Which is kind of hard to wrap your mind around. So it's like me and my dream can see, and I know what I'm seeing, but my dream awareness doesn't process the visual, which is very strange.
That's amazing. So when you open your eyes first thing in the morning, where some people will kind of be getting these random flashes of images, and I'll sort of get kind of 3 or 4 second kind of sequences that make absolutely no sense, and I'll have a couple of them, and they're a bit jumbled together, and there's vaguely a story there, but there's never a fine thread between them. What's coming to your mind when you're lying there in bed, eyes open? Like, what are those next 10, 15 seconds if you are remembering a dream?
It's the story. I still remember the story, the idea, what was happening in the dream. It's just I'm thinking about it like I would think in my waking state, where it's just like a concept. It's like what was happening. So I'll still like have that kind of awareness. It's just not represented in a visual kind of way.
So it's all words.
It's all word for me. It's all words. Yeah, it's all that inner speech. Now, there's a whole other kind of can of worms around people who have no inner speech.
Right.
We probably won't get into that today, but that's even one for me. And going back to that, like it's hard for people to conceive of, a way of perception of consciousness that's different from yours. I have a hard time with that myself. Like I don't know how I would navigate the world without that inner speech, because it is a fundamental aspect of my kind of inner experience. Whereas I'm very often, I wouldn't say it's the only way I can process information, but it's the way I make it real. I make it like very, concrete, is that I've verbalized it internally. So, right now I'm using the voice to, speak to you through the microphone. When I stop speaking, that inner voice runs in my mind. It's processing information, it's thinking about things. So really goes to show that diversity of kind of conscious experience.
Absolutely, and that's the main point that I've been so fascinated in. Have you ever come across Dr. Russell Herbert? I'd love to connect you.
I would love a connection. I think I've read some of his work. I think I even emailed him maybe a few years ago. I don't know if I ever heard back. So yeah, please do that. That'd be great.
So for the listeners that haven't seen my previous episode with him, he's the inventor of the experience sampling method, which is basically where he sends out a bleeper to somebody, and at random points in the day, it will beep. That's all its function is. And then you have to basically immediately try and recall what your inner experience was, sort of 1 microsecond before the beep is the idea. And the biggest takeaway that he's gotten is that people have a ridiculously poor idea of their own inner experience. A lot of people will come to him saying, I'm 100% confident that I inner monologue all of the time. It's constant, it's there, it's nonstop. And then he's had some people by the end of 30 sessions be like, Turns out I actually don't at all. I thought I was 100%. I'm actually 0%. I'm, and that's very reality shattering for them. Uh, for one point, I find it fascinating that we live in such a distracted world that we don't understand our own inner experience. But I would be so interested in, if you did this bleeper test with him, what your inner experience would be like. If it's just 95% words, is it, if in your sensory experience and what you're seeing in the moment, do you recall that any differently to somebody who can visualize it and mentalize it? Things just, it's so fascinating to me. He did this test with someone called Sadie Dingfelder, who's another woman that you should definitely speak to. She goes by the face blind journalist. So she's a scientific journalist who has very severe prosopagnosia, and she also has aphantasia, and she's also stereo blind. I am amazing woman, incredibly funny and really good with language, really good with words. And she did this test with, she also realized only when she was 38 that she had any of these things, because she was doing an assignment on prosopagnosia, and she did the entire assignment on prosopagnosia, and then the second time she was going around to it, she was like starting to draw the links, but she did an entire project on prosopagnosia without realizing she had it. Anyway, she did this entire bleep test with Dr. Russell Hurlburt, and it was so interesting. Like her inner experience, well, what he concluded was that she mostly didn't have one, which I find so interesting. She was aware that she was having an inner experience, but couldn't indicate even remotely what the contents of that experience was. It's so mind bending to think about. If you were to guess now what your inner experience, how it breaks down from inner speaking to sensory awareness, he talks about unsymbolized thinking, which is sort of what you talk about is concepts. What do you think your inner experience is like? What kind of words do you use to describe your experience?
Yeah, it's I would say, hard to describe like what percentages of stuff. I mean, I would be interested in doing that
Yeah, I
kind of
really
thing
want
just to
to.
try
Yeah,
and like,
please.
try and put some numbers behind it. But I would. It's definitely a mix of that that inner worded thought, um, unsymbolized thinking, which is as a concept even hard to kind of wrap your mind around what that even means.
Yes.
But it's like yeah, it's ideas. It's like perceiving. It's like thinking of ideas before you've put them into words. Maybe is how.
Yes. That could be a way of thinking about it. At least that's my understanding, unless it's also mistaken. It is very
Yeah,
abstract. It's sort of the abstract part of thinking, is my understanding.
yeah, and then yeah, then there's pure like external sensory awareness. So it's like shifting the attention to just your like your external senses. So it's like what am I seeing? What am I smelling? What am I hearing? Paying attention to that. Like this is actually one of those ones where I find quite fascinating. Is like now I've gotten when I'm out, like let's say for a coffee with someone, sometimes I can see or perceive in someone else that their attention has shifted away from, let's say, our conversation into
Right.
some kind of internal experience that they're having. Maybe I've said something that triggers a memory or triggers something inside them, and now I can tell that their attention is split between the internal and external.
Right.
Whereas I find that doesn't really happen to me that often. It can, in like if there's like maybe something very important going on in my life and I'm thinking, it's like taking up that worded thought in my mind. But on a day-to-day basis, like when I'm with somebody talking, it's like my attention is highly focused on the listening intently, let's say, or just like trying to or perceiving what someone else is saying.
Yeah.
And so that's another one of those kind of interesting areas where are there like differences between aphants and hypervisualizers. It's like, well, attention is finite, and if you have this whole other realm of sensory experience happening in your mind, you have to juggle the attention in some kind of way, whether that's switching back and forth or half attention here, half attention there. Without those other sensory realms, the attention can be, put more focus on,
100%.
divided differently. Yeah.
That's another, like you mentioned at the start of the podcast, if you were offered the pill where you could, mentally visualize all the time, you wouldn't take it. If I was
Yeah.
offered one that meant that my attention would never fade off during a podcast episode, I'd be a way better host. Like it's so difficult, especially on a digital screen, not for your attention not to drift off at any point. They're complicated conversations. My attention will wander. I think that's absolutely a benefit. Do you find
Yeah.
it quite easy to focus? Because, wandering attention is literally the antithesis to focused work, right?
Yeah. Definitely, like as long as I'm interested, let's say, in what's going on, my attention and focus is pretty good. Things that are I don't find interesting, it's hard, then other ideas and stuff will pop into my mind, maybe that take it away. But which I think is similar for most people. But yeah, it's one of those things where you can or at least I've really started to notice in people is that toggle between internal and external
Right.
attention. Yeah, because attention is kind of like one of those main things, like where you put your attention. It's like that thing. It's like I forget what the quote is, escapes my mind, but it's like where you put your attention is like it's everything. It's like if you've ever seen those things where count the number of times the
Right.
black team passes the basketball and the thing the bear walks across the screen and you miss the dancing bear completely because you're just so focused on this other thing.
I've made a video on this, attentional blindness. I'll link this video below for people that haven't done it. Have you heard the follow up to that experiment, which I find hilarious? Where the main experiment is that there's like 8 people and they're passing a ball around on a screen and they're quite close up. You can see everyone really, really close. And the question comes up like, count the amount of times people in a white t-shirt pass the ball. And there's people in white t-shirts and black t-shirts is my memory of it. And so you're counting, they're passing back and forth. Halfway through the video, the gorilla comes on the screen, it bangs its chest. It literally stays there for like 3 seconds, banging its chest right in the middle of the frame, and then walks off. And I think it's 50% of people in the original test didn't see the gorilla. The follow-up to that, which I find hilarious, is that he was giving this test, he was giving this lecture. I'm not sure if he won an award or what it was, but he was giving this lecture to a whole bunch of neuroscientists and people who knew the trick, right? They knew what video they were going to be shown. And he comes up and he plays the video and he's like, how many people saw the gorilla? And everyone put up their hand and was like, okay. And then he was like, well, how many people saw I can't remember what it was, crocodile or something. He added an extra thing, basically. And I can't remember what the thing was. And no one saw it because they expected the trick. Again, the attentional blindness completely went. So they saw the gorilla, but they didn't see whatever the additional thing was. So even if there's an attentional blindness trick, you're still attentionally blind to the other thing anyway. I thought that was that's very.
It's a really fascinating kind of thing that happens. It happens to everybody. The first time I saw that, same thing. I missed it.
Yeah.
But you have to think how this affects your kind of daily life, right? All the time. If you're and the more things you have to juggle in that attentional kind of space, the more things that I think that are easy to miss. This is just and this is just me, kind of talking out loud about some of the things
no, it's super interesting. About. It's really, really interesting. Do we have any idea what's happening in the brain of people with aphantasia?
Yeah, there's competing theories. There was one just published a few weeks ago about unconscious imagery. Like, so is it possible that some type of because we're aware of visuals, it could be that there's some type of visual representation that is just unconscious.
Right.
I don't want to get into I'm not the neuroscientist, so I'm not going to describe exactly what's happening. There's some great resources on the website for that we can direct some fans to, but what's for sure is that there are measurable differences between visualizers and non-visualizers in terms of brain activity. What's clear is that when visualizers are thinking about an object not present, there are areas of the brain that are active that are not active for aphants.
Right. Do you know what's happening in the mind? So, do people when they visualize, like people without aphantasia, when they visualize, do you know if they have that visual cortex activity? Like, I know that when you see something and you have a visual perception of an object, you can often decode sort of that activity in the visual cortex. So if you're perceiving a circle, you can almost see a circle of neural activity within the visual cortex. When you get to the lower level of kind of lines and shapes, that's
Yeah.
represented almost in the exact same architecture. I am. Do you know of any studies done with aphantasia in terms of is that activity still there? Again, is it that it's not being projected to consciousness?
Yeah, there's some activity, though you do see some differences. There's a great paper by Young Hao Liu. He was at the Paris Brain Institute, who showed that there's some activity, but some connectivity between regions is different. And the activity pattern looks a little bit different. They don't know if they call this unconscious imagery or unvisual thoughts. So there's some type of visual activity, but the patterns look different. And so I'll send you the link after. Maybe you can link the paper for those who kind of want to dive a little bit deeper. I also did my own podcast interview with him where he describes this in some good detail for people who want to learn a little bit more.
I'll link all of the resources below because there's so much. What kind of are you kind of up to date with the aphantasia research that's being done at the moment? Like what kind of lines of experiment are researchers looking at? What are the big questions in aphantasia that people are trying to find answers to?
Great. Yeah, there's tons of it. We're working with many universities across the US and in Europe where most of the activity is happening. There's things like how does visual imagery impact things like your grit is an interesting one. Educational outcomes or learning strategies. Mental health is one of the big areas of research. There's some interesting work going on around if kind of related to Hurlburt's work, where it's like if you don't have images, like what is the other kind of main method, of thinking that aphants have? That's happening in Germany right now. Lots on memory. I would say there's quite a bit going on around memory. So I think that lots of progress on that front. There's some cool stuff going on in France around motor imagery and aphantasia for two reasons. One, because it's very important in like sports performance and stuff. Visualization is a big,
right.
Or motor imagery kind of visualization is a big, common technique. But it's also very common in rehabilitation. So for kind of different types of for other different diseases or physical traumas, the visualization or motor imagery exercises are kind of a way to get through that. And it does seem like aphants have a more difficult time with that. So what type of alternative strategies, might be applicable. So actually, I think I haven't looked at it in a little while, but the last time I looked, aphantasia was in like the top 2% of new research interest worldwide. And
wow.
I would say anecdotally, that's probably still the case or growing, because we hear from researchers like every week from somewhere in the world who are like, starting a new study and want to connect with aphants. So anyone who's listening and wants to participate in research, we often send out, different opportunities to participate.
Yeah, definitely. I'll link all of these resources down below. That's so interesting, all those different areas that you mentioned, because assumedly, I mean, you mentioned 3 or 4% prevalence. Like that's such a large number. I am like what would you think the percentage of people that know that they have aphantasia? Like, there's probably a huge difference there, right?
Yeah, tiny percent. I couldn't even put a number on it, but the most, by far, most people who have it don't know that they have it. They don't know it's a thing. Haven't discovered it yet. It's changed a lot in the last, 5-6 years. Aphantasia was just this obscure term in a paper, and we tried to kind of bring it to life and give it some publicity. And it's not nothing. Like New York Times, National Geographic, all the many big publications have kind of written about it. So I would say the awareness is growing.
Right.
But still, it's got to be a tiny fraction, and it's a global phenomenon, right? So we hear from, I like to say, like remote islands in Alaska to the island of Madagascar. There's like people from all over the world have reached out, because they've discovered this about themselves, and I find that quite fascinating too. Like when you think about like different cultures and different contexts, and and there's been writing about kind of mental imagery or visualization going back all the way to, like Aristotle famously wrote that the mind does not think without images. So like this goes back. There's a long tradition of writing about mental images, visualization, the third eye. Lots of different kind of analogies or things like that about visualization. So it's a fascinating area and growing fast though, which is cool to see.
Yeah, you're doing amazing work. How would you summarize your mission and your overall goal with the Aphantasia Network? What are you really trying to achieve?
A couple of points. One is that central place for people when they discover, who kind of like me when I first discovered, felt kind of like isolated, didn't know what it meant for me, had a little bit of that psychological stress response. So having resources for people when they discover, to know that they're not alone, to help make sense of what this means for their life. That's one big piece. Two is to help bridge the science and the public. Lots of great work going on in this field. We help enable a lot of that work through recruitment efforts and connections and stuff like that at the network. But then also help make the science kind of public. So much great science, and not just aphantasia, but probably in every field, just sits in academic journals, inaccessible to, the vast majority of people. So bringing that awareness. And third, it's really to help understand how does mental imagery, not just for aphant, but mental imagery, how does mental imagery impact life, work, and well-being? I think the better we understand this, the more different types of techniques and strategies and things people can develop to deal with all types of situations. Because, yes, I hear from, thousands of aphants, trying to understand what it means, but I also hear from people on the other end of the spectrum who are like, I wish I could turn these images off because they keep me up at night. And it's like, so the better we understand how visualization and mental imagery impacts our lives, I think the better answers we have for people to deal with the different kinds of situations where more or less imagery might be beneficial.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Have you noticed, are there any particular careers that people with aphantasia generally flock to? Have you noticed any sort of just interesting findings in careers, vocations, hobbies, anything there?
Yes, it does seem like there's a bent towards STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, probably because of that bent towards abstract thinking.
Right.
So that kind of checks out. But in saying that, tons of creatives like your sister and like others who don't fit that mold. But if you look at the stats, there's definitely more of a pull towards those abstract kind of fields.
Yeah. Like I remember this whole talk about abstract brings me back to college when I was learning organic chemistry. That's a good example of a subject that, like, I think any attempt of visualizing it just sends you down a wrong path. It's just too weird. It doesn't work in images. It's just too strange. I think anyone that has studied organic chemistry will identify with that. I actually think I would have been better at that subject if I just wasn't trying to imagine it at all, because it's just too strange. Any image that you can conjure up is falsely leading your intuition down wrong paths. And I think that's really fascinating, where it can be a big advantage.
Yeah. I've never taken organic chemistry, but I'm sure it's the case. I'm sure it's the case with many different fields where, it's those. Again, it's thinking about like what are the advantages and your supposed disadvantage. There's a lot of strength in that.
Do you think it's trainable? So, like, one thing that I talked to Sadie about was, she went through a routine program of trying to recognize faces, where she would sit there for hours looking at faces, and she was doing this under the guidance of researchers. She wasn't just doing it by herself, and she was trying to become better at recognizing faces through flexing that muscle and really applying effort to it. Do you think it's possible for non-visualizers to train that muscle?
For people who have some form of imagery, maybe it's weak imagery, because again, maybe, I don't know if we've hit this yet, it's not like you have images or you don't.
Right.
It is a spectrum of capability. On the high end of the spectrum, there's cases of like projection type of imagery where people are like have a form of augmented reality. I just got an email this morning from someone who's talking to me about how she uses AutoCAD. It's like the software for architecture and stuff, and she can pull the object out of AutoCAD into the room and spin it around and look at it like she's using AR, but
right,
all, in her mind.
Cool.
So I mean that's a crazy, on the other side. So for people who have weak imagery, so maybe they see outlines or flashes of pictures that don't maybe stay. There is some good evidence that you can improve that over time. I haven't seen any, let's say, reliable cases of people who have no imagery and then turned it back on.
Right.
Especially if they've had it from birth. There's I think 1 or 2 papers of people who lost it, who have that like acquired aphantasia, and through some kind of treatment were able to regain it. Theoretically, though, many people have told me theoretically, both Paolo, he's at the Paris Brain Institute, and Joel Pearson, the University of New South Wales, they both told me that theoretically for aphants you could probably turn it back on. But the question is like, would you want to? Because it's like, you've never had this thing, and then it could be like very overwhelming.
Right.
And two, we don't know like how exactly you do it, but theoretically it's possible.
So is that with neural technology, like an implant type situation?
Perhaps. They've talked about different types of like stimulation.
Interesting.
Yeah, so don't really know, and don't know how much of that work, or if any of that work, like research, is actually happening. There's, I'm sure, lots of ethics issues and things like that as well. These things kind of move very slowly in an academic sense, but interesting to see what'll happen. I think for a portion of people who really do struggle with knowing that they have this, and there are a subset who really do struggle and would love nothing more than to turn it back on. Maybe they'd want to. Totally fine. If I could try it for a day, I would. But
so what do you think if you wake up tomorrow, you open your inbox, Elon Musk, he's recruiting for his new Neuralink trials. It's to work with aphantasia to try and restore visual imagery. Are you signing up to that clinical trial? It would make great content. It'd be great.
It would make exactly
for the content, man. At the very least, it'd be great content.
Give me lots to write about. I would probably do it.
It's a great. That's a New York Times bestseller. That is.
Yeah, absolutely. How I cured my aphantasia.
Because the scary part is, like, the brain is really a comparison system. Like it all it does is contrast and compare things. So the real nightmare scenario is if somehow that sensation is restored, and then either it goes away again, and then you have the comparison, but you have to live your whole life knowing that what you've lost. It's the whole situation. It's like, would you rather be blind from birth or, lose your eyesight at age 20 or something? Well, most people, I think, would go from birth, because you're living with that comparison your whole life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the same for aphantasia, because you grow up and learn the adaptation strategies, way easier when you're young and it's all you've ever known, right? But if you didn't learn those adaptation strategies, it's going to be much harder later in your life. Like, it's like that thing. It's like, it's way easier to learn a language when you're young. I think before you're 7, otherwise it gets increasingly difficult as you get older.
Right.
Same kind of thing here for navigating without images or without sight, like that example.
Talk to me about those adaptation strategies. What are some things that you do? Because you're obviously incredibly high functioning. You run an organization that touches thousands of people every single week. What sort of strategies have you had to adopt yourself to become such a high functioning guy?
Um, there's a couple of things I would say. One is like, know what your strengths and know what your weaknesses are. I don't think that matters. I think it's like that's for aphantasia and not.
Right.
Like, I think it's in any kind of thing. Know what you're good at, know what you're not good at. The better you know yourself, the more you can kind of adapt to it. So, like for me, um, knowing that my memory for like, not that my memory for people is bad, but like just keeping all that stuff in working memory, what we talked about last time, like I'm not going to keep that all in my mind. So I have to take really good notes. If stuff's not in my calendar, I'm not coming to the meeting. Like it's just, because I just won't remember,
Right.
So there's lots of type of just, boring, mundane things that, I have to keep on top of. Otherwise, I'll fall behind. And then there are other things like, for me, and this is probably not aphantasia, but I know if I have to do deep work, like, keep the headphones on, put on the music, and then I can stay focused for hours and hours and get a lot of deep work done. But if I don't have the headphones and the music and somebody walks by, like I'll hear that and then I'll want to pay attention to what something else is happening. So like just like little, these are small just adaptations. It's hard to even like index what they all are.
Right.
Probably something I should do more of. Thinking about those kind of things. Then there are other things like knowing, knowing what you're interested in stuff. So for me, like I know that I'm not a big fan of fiction and all the things with all these like visual descriptions and stuff. So if I am reading something, with lots of visual descriptions, just skip it. Who cares? Don't have to read this. I'm going to get bored if I read it.
Yes.
Like just go to the next kind of interesting part. So it's like knowing yourself, knowing what you're interested in, and kind of adapting that way. But I wouldn't say that that's necessarily an aphantasia adaptation thing. I think that's just like a general life, like play to your strengths type of thing.
Yeah. Do you like fiction TV shows? Is that just a reading thing?
Yeah, love a good drama. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you plan for the future? You say you're very present oriented. Do you think often about what you have coming up? I mean, you said there that if a meeting isn't in your calendar, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You're very oriented to the present. Do you find it difficult to plan for the future and think about your next 6 months, think about your next year?
The way I describe it is like I live with a compass and not a map.
Right.
It's like I have points in the future. I know where I want to go, generally speaking. I don't have a very detailed picture, obviously, of like what that looks like. But I have pretty strong concepts for where I'd like to bring things, and what direction I need to move to get there. And then I deal with the information and the challenges along the way. Because, I honestly think that this is, actually a pro for me. I think many people have like an exact route of like how they think their life is going to unfold and exactly what it'll look like when they get there. And then, you might end up being disappointed when it doesn't look exactly like that or when unexpected things happen along the way.
Right.
I don't have a concept of like or an image of all the things I'm going to face. As this thing has grown, I would have never imagined, how the Aphantasia Network and the Aphantasia community would have evolved, 5 years ago. I knew people were interested in it. I knew the research was important. I knew I wanted to, be that place where people could come to, get some kind of solace and understanding of their own experiences. I had no concept of how it would exactly play out or what the exact steps were going to be. I just knew I was moving in that direction. I had that compass orientation and was just working every day in that direction. And then you deal with kind of what comes. I think that's generally true in my life for the network and for other things as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like I think inevitably it causes people a lot of pain when they articulately plan out every step and then shit hits the fan, as it always does in life, and it never goes to plan. And then you're thinking, God, I had it. I knew I was going to go from A to B to C and D. I had it all mapped out, and then shit just came and destroyed everything. And I'm sure that, for me, I mean, it causes me some anxiety. It causes me some stress. I'm sure that ruins people. That it brings from the start of what you said with the artists, you know, they had this really well articulated vision of what the end product would be, and then when it didn't match expectation, it was really upsetting. If you just don't have that expectation in the first place, you've nothing to be upset about.
Yeah, nothing to be disappointed about. Exactly, and I think you articulated it well there.
I'd be so curious. This is going way down the neuroscience track, but I'd be so interested in how it interacts with your reward system. So, like, dopamine is very misunderstood in culture. You know, people think of dopamine as like pleasure or TikTok or drugs. Dopamine is really about the expectation of reward and pursuit, the happiness of pursuit rather than the pursuit of happiness. And I'm really curious about how your dopamine system wires you for the future when you sort of have like a bit of an abstract plan, but it's not this really articulated vision. You know, like what dopamine loves is dopamine paints you this picture of what your life can be. It puts you in the Ferrari and it puts you with the model beside you, and it paints that vision and then kind of makes the steps to get there feel good. But I'm really curious in how, if is there actual reward system differences in the wiring of how you model the future and how you work towards it, because you're a very hardworking guy, you know, like that's dopamine that's making that hard work feel good, but it's not like you're working towards a very strict vision, kind of just different points. I'd be so curious if that research needs to be done.
Great area of study. There's a good study for you, Evan. That's one we would definitely get behind, because it makes sense. Like, yeah, how like that. It's one. Obviously, there's lots of aphantasics who are very hardworking, who have these ideas for the future and work towards it and achieve them. But yeah, that reward system probably does work slightly differently, or maybe not even works differently, but just like the artist example kind of manifests maybe differently.
Yeah, I'd love to see that data. It's going to be the next couple of years, the next decade is going to be fascinating. Where would you, if you had your unlimited funding and you had your magic wand, what are the areas that you're really interested in? You know, even for your own personal experience, like what experiments would you do? What do you think are the biggest questions? What are you specifically most interested in?
Yeah, great question. Life, work, and well-being. So I think we can go through them in order. Life, it's like, you see lots of things around like relationships. Because when you think about relationships, you think, okay, your memory, your past memories with people. How does this impact kind of how you remember your friends and your family and how you stay connected with them? It's one of the ones, one of the maybe kind of sadder emails I get, from some people who feel like they're completely disconnected from their friends or their family because they're just so detached from their memories or from the shared experiences with others. So that's obviously not everybody with aphantasia, but there's a big subsegment. The work one I find personally, just because I'm very career oriented, I find very fascinating because back to this concept of like the idea that people can be speaking the same language but have very different internal representations.
Right.
So it's like how do these kind of internal representations like manifest in day-to-day kind of working relationships, teamwork, things like this, where you might be saying the same thing but have very different internal images, different tokens. How often does this lead to miscommunication, misunderstanding, misalignment? It happens all the time where people, say that, they agree to something and then the outcome comes and, then there's a conflict because for whatever reason it was, it wasn't what they thought it would be.
Yeah.
Practically, what does, then what kind of like practical research? One is around how do we like effectively understand, map, we're actually currently working on this and I've made some decent progress. What kind of like, surveys are very limited because surveys, it's like, it's so subjective. How do I know, a 5 on a scale is right. My 4 is your 4. How do we know that?
Yes.
So what kind of like, what does the future of these kind of measurement technologies look like? So how can we effectively map what are the internal experiences of people? For us, it's sensory imagination. Can we effectively map this in people what does that true spectrum of experience really look like?
Yeah.
I want to get way past the vivid, from more vivid to less vivid, because it's a multi-dimensional experience,
Yeah.
right? There's movement involved. There's duration of the image experience. Some people just have flashes. Some people can see and hold an image in their mind, manipulate it, change the color, rotate it. So what is the true range of imagery experience? I think that's like the first major kind of research that we're working on and would love to see. How do you effectively measure that? And then what are those impacts on life, work, and well-being? What does it mean that you're here on the spectrum versus somewhere else? Because I don't think it's guaranteed that just because you have these kind of differences that you learn the adaptation strategies. It might just be that some people are fortunate enough just through circumstance that they have either the support or other personality traits that lead them to discovering what those, how they can become, a top tier scientist or physicist or whatever it might be. There are many others, I'm sure, even more, who have very similar cognitive traits, but never really learn how to utilize them to fulfill that potential.
Right.
And I think the better you know yourself, the more you can adapt your approach to maximize that potential.
Well said, man. Well said. I think it's so cool. The bit that you touched on that fascinates me is, again, just the spectrum of consciousness. I love the extremes. I love the bizarre. I love the wondrous stuff. Things like synesthesia fascinate me, all of these different ways that consciousness presents, I just think is so, so cool. And if it's a message that I can help distribute in any way, I always will, because I just think it's so interesting. If any part of this podcast has resonated with a listener, almost certainly, if this gets any amount of views, there's probably people listening to this that don't know they have aphantasia, that might be at the end of the episode be thinking, actually, a couple of those things sounded a bit familiar. A few of those problems that he mentioned, I sort of have, I resonate with that a bit. What would you say to those people? Where should they go? What advice, if they're feeling in any way confused or anxious about it, kind of speak generally to them?
Well, whether you think you have it or not, you can go to aphantasia.com/VVIQ. There's a little just short questionnaire you can take with some simple questions to help you kind of flesh out that thinking. And it'll also, if you so choose, it'll put you in kind of the ecosystem of emails and content that will help you kind of navigate some of that understanding. So I send out a weekly email kind of just exploring some of these ideas. There's a big community of people who, are just like you. If you're just, thinking that you might, share in the aphantasia experience, know that you're not alone. Lots of successful people and just regular people in kind of every career you can think of also have it. So go check that out. The point I'll drive home, belief is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, try not to think of yourself as defective or lacking in something. If I had my way, I would change the definition, to image-free thinking.
Right.
Not, I wouldn't define it as the lack of something, because that kind of framing alone is not the complete picture.
Right. We should lead the way in the rebrand. What would you?
Yeah.
How would
absolutely.
you? I think you need something a little bit more succinct than image-free thinking. Maybe we'll workshop that. We'll do some brainstorming.
We'll workshop that one.
We'll rebrand whoever we need to rebrand on the word aphantasia, because I agree that it comes across way too much as a deficit when there is. I mean, I think we've probably spent more of this podcast talking about the benefits than drawbacks, which I also think is amazing. Anyway, Tom, this has been so much fun, so much fun. I learned so much. I think it's an incredibly interesting conversation. I really want to do all that I can to spread these messages. And, if people leave this conversation thinking that, wow, consciousness is actually just a little bit more variable than I thought, then I think this is a successful one. I wish you all the best in your mission and the future successes and everything. And I thought this was such a great conversation, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evan. Great work. Thanks for everything you do. And look forward to speaking again.